Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. If you're looking for a winter project, you might be like me and have considered building your own fly rod. I've been really tempted over the years, but have never taken the plunge, as I've always feared I'd make a horrific mess of it. In the latest edition of our magazine Fly Culture, Duncan Philpott has a piece where he talks about his lockdown project of making a rod, taking it to the local stream and catching a trout on it. In fact, caught several trout on it. And after reading this, I've been giving it some more thought. So much so that I've enlisted the help of Sandy Nelson, who has been building on blanks of various materials for as long as I can remember. I'm sure if you'll find this as interesting as me, and perhaps will even consider taking the plunge yourself. Sandy, it's great to have you along. Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast.
Hi, Pete. It's great to be here.
Thanks for taking the time to talk with me. Have you had a good season? We're going to get on to the rods and everything else, but I wanted to hear a little bit about your season, because I think if I marked mine out of 10, it would probably be a 3.5, a 4 out of 10. But how's your season been? Has it been a good one for you?
It's been pretty good, yeah. I wouldn't go as low as that, I must admit. Probably more of a 6 to a 7, really. I've managed to find plenty decent sized fish. I had my biggest brownie early season, very, very early season, while I was salmon fishing, so it doesn't really count. But it was an absolute belter. And cracking condition as well. So that sort of set the season off. It sort of set a really high bar for the brownie season, that's for sure. But I've had quite a few. I've mostly on the dry as usual, which is good. Various sizes. No other PBs. My dry fly PB was last year, so I didn't break that this year. So I don't know how else you would describe the season. It's just been good. I've enjoyed it.
Good, and that's the
nice year to be out.
Good, that's the main thing about it. And let's put this in context, because I know we've had some of your images in Fly Culture and on Eastleigh Fish many years ago. So let's put these sorts of things into context. You talked in the terms of PB, and you started with a nice fish. What sort of size are we talking about of those fish?
The PB, that was 8.4 £4. Yes, I know. But it took a woolly gun tube fly. So you want context on the rest of the season. My best brownie of the season's been £4.10. I've had probably half a dozen that were over the £4 mark, all on the dry fly. That's a decent season on the Aberdeenshire Don. If you take the time to hunt them down and watch the river a lot. I've fished it since I was 11 years old, so it's sort of home water, so I have a good handle on it. That was on one beat. I had big fish, £6.10 on the dry on my home beat, that was the 3rd of April. That's kind of where the season went, I think, largely, is early doors. I got a lot of good fish really early on, and then as the season went on, we struggled a bit. Plenty numbers, but I'm more of a trout hunter than anything else these days. I like chasing down the big ones. This is one of the reasons why everybody associates me with glass, because since I started using glass rods, my ability to land the big fish has sort of quadrupled. I think I've always managed to hook them and always managed to lose them, but these days I'm managing to get them in, which is good. Dry fly really is the thing, though. That's what floats my boat. And that's a lot of people.
That's really, really impressive as well. And we're going to come on to the glass, obviously, in, very, very shortly. But I think, am I right in thinking the Don is another one of these really good early season rivers? And that makes me wonder why my season, where I am, it takes some getting going. And because it was so cold, I think I was sort of bailed out back end, and I had a nice trout on on a dry fly. But it is a good early season. What are you fishing? March browns, Granham would you be fishing, or large dark olives?
We have fantastic hatches of all of those. The trout, the Granham, they don't usually take dry. You'll catch them on pupas and nymphs and stuff for Granhams, but very rarely you'll see a Granham hatch with a rise associated with it. Large dark olives seem to be the thing. The olives is a season-wide thing on the Don. We've got large darks, small darks, we've got blue wings, we've got there's green duns, there's all sorts comes off the river during the year. But the olives, large dark olives, I think hatch from about the middle of March to the end of October. You'll see them all the time. It's quite incredible. But we've iron blues, brook duns, March brown, proper March browns. The fish can be funny with March browns though. It can be really entertaining, especially early season, because they'll be almost frightened of them. You'll see them come up and look and then sort of shy away and shy away and shy away. And then one of them's suddenly brave enough and he'll try one and it's food! And then they all go mad and it's just brilliant, It's really funny. But the Don, I think the Don's quite special. It's a fairly unique water source. It's a lot like the Derbyshire Wye in terms of its chemical makeup. So it's kind of like a limestone river. It's not a limestone river, but it's kind of like one. It has very similar chemistry, so it's very fertile. We get ranunculus. We've got loads of gammarus, shrimps. So if you want to Euro nymph it or Czech nymph it or whatever, you have a fantastic time. It bores me to tears, to be honest, but that's just the nature of the beast. I'd rather walk miles and make 5 casts than spend all day fishing little squares. But hey, we all do different things and we all like whatever floats your own boat, I suppose.
That's a really interesting point. And what you said about, that I'm thinking about your sort of angling CV, which is clearly impressive. And there's lots I think people can draw from that. And I know personally I've spoken about it and other guests have, is that finding those big fish, yes, you can luck one sometimes, but by being observant. And I think what you said about the March Browns there, that's clearly the case, that you have observed these fish, their behavior, and worked from there rather than fishing the water. You're fishing to that fish. And I think I would count myself in that same camp, because I really enjoy that aspect of it, of waiting for that moment. But I can remember when I was younger as well that I just wanted to fish. And we talk about these,
absolutely.
We talk about these stages of fly anglers and everything else. But I think that's a really interesting one. One of the things I wanted to talk to you then, you're finding these huge fish. And while I can pick your brains about this before I pick your brains about rods as well, is what sort of tippet strength are you fishing for these huge, great fish?
Normally 5x or 4x, depending on which flies I've got on. If I'm fishing March browns or bigger dries, brook duns, even large dark olives, which early season with us are usually a size 12, I'll fish 4x tippet all the time. Is it 4x? I suppose it's 4.5x technically. I use a 4x tapered leader, and then I use Trout Hunter nylon, which I prefer. It's like I think it's a co-poly. But he does it in 1/2x sizes, so I use a 4.5x tippet on a 4x tapered leader. And then later on in the season, when the flies get a bit smaller, so when we're down at small dark olives and some of the small sedges that we get on an evening, I'll go down to 5.5x. Very, very rarely will I fish less than 5.5x, and I think that's 4.8 pound. I never fish light.
Yeah.
You just can't afford to. They can be absolutely brutal, some of the fish. We have a phenomenal, in late June, early July, we get a phenomenal sedge hatch on an evening, which usually lasts for about 30 to 40 minutes. And it's usually sometime between 11:15 at night and midnight, midnight, depending on the weather. And when it kicks off, that's the most intense 30 to 40 minutes of fishing of the season. and we'll get about six weeks worth of that. The sedges are about a size 14, so it's super strong hooks. It's 4x tippets, 5-weight rods, and it's hang on and hope. And we get a run of sea trout about middle of June usually, and that seems to fire up the big browns. All of a sudden reappear, and they come out in like a gang, and they just move around the beats of the river, and you can pick them up on most of the beats up here, and there'll be a gang of big fish, and you'll get, like I say, over that 6 weeks, you'll probably pick up most of your biggest fish of the season. And and the glass helps a lot, because they're just brutal when they hit.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that I'm thinking about while you're saying those things. One is I'm a subscriber to you in the sense of thicker diameter versus thinner diameter. I'm not sure how much difference that actually makes. And I've upped mine. I'm not catching fish your sort of size, but for West Country standards, they're pretty good, 2 to 3 pounds. And I've upped to 4 pound, and I've not noticed any difference going from 2.5 to 3 to 4 because I was getting broken by these sizable fish. I've not noticed a downswing in those. The other thing I was thinking that we were talking off mic about fly tying, my gut, and I'm probably got this completely wrong, but my gut is, do you carry many patterns? Because my gut is probably the answer to that's no, but I'm love to be proved wrong.
You're going to be proved absolutely right. I fish 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 patterns essentially. I change the size. I sometimes change the shade, but largely they're just descriptive. I have an emerging sedge pattern. I've got an emerging clinkhammer style fly, a CDC plume tip, which is like a dun. CDC spider's my biggest catcher. It's my go-to all the time. It's probably the only fly in my box I regard as my own pattern, because I've been tying it. It's been in magazines. It's been all over. I've been tying it for best part of 20 years. And it's so simple. And certain colours work a lot better than others. I basically fish that in a 10, a 12, a 14, and a 16. And that's usually my first port of call. It works as an emerger, a dry, a cripple, even as a hatching nymph. You can swing it like a spider. You can fluff it up and float it like a dry. And it's a simple fly. Takes a couple of minutes to tie. So they're easy to replace. It's like, I think it's Bob Wyatt always refers to them as ammunition. And for me, that's my ammunition. That's definitely, that's the biggest fly. And a tungsten bead pheasant tail nymph, in case I have to, because sometimes you don't have any choice. You have to. Streamers is something I've gotten into recently. I still haven't got the knack of that yet. I can get some enormous follows, some massive takes, but I can't seem to hook them. So I think next year is going to be a year of trying a bit more with some interesting, maybe some smaller streamers rather than these great big articulated things. But I still catch all my big fish on dries. Yeah. And it's nearly always either CDC spider or an emerging sedge pattern.
Nice. That's cool to hear. And simple seems to be best. And I think I've said on here before, Paul Proctor's Pearl Butt Merger, and that to me, I think we fish them more confidently as well. But I fish that in a size 14, and I reckon I can catch fish in most occasions with that. There'll be some where they're not, obviously, but I think I've got a pretty good chance of catching them there. Interesting what you say about streamers, and that has grown in popularity, and I use it when I feel appropriate. And what you were saying about fish chasing, I do wonder if some of that is territorial as well. And they almost sort of escort the fly off of their property, as it were. And I wonder if there are, when I've seen those situations happen, and I do wonder if there is an element of that, right? You're moving away, that's fine. I'm making sure you're staying away rather than nailing it. Because I find with a streamer, if they're going to hit it, generally they hit it pretty quickly, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think the fish I tend to get that actually hit it and hook up are usually 1.5 pound mark. The ones that'll chase it are some of the bigger ones, the 5-6 pounders. You can see them come out from underneath ledges and everything and chase this thing across the river. And Stuart Smith, who's a phenomenal tyer of streamers, he's a good mate of mine. We fished together a few times. I was picking his brain earlier on in the year because he sort of got me into this with some of his flies. And he says, you're not fishing it fast enough. He says it's all about aggression because they're not looking for food. They're chasing the fish out of their territory. So if you're fishing it at a medium pace, they just nip at it to get it to move. Whereas if you come through as fast as you possibly can, then they just slash at it and then they tend to hook themselves. So that's next year's project. That's
it's always
probably a lot of fun.
It's always good to have a plan, isn't it? And I'm sort of, at this time of year, I'm sort of thinking about rising fish. I'm thinking about lovely shirt sleeve, T-shirt conditions and everything else. And those things sort of keep you going. But I wanted to move on to the rods because you've alluded, and again, it's something else we push a little bit on this podcast when people are thinking about rods, is the ability, obviously, to deliver the fly to the target, but also the ability to play fish. And when it comes to glass, my experience is minuscule compared to yours. But I did a podcast where I landed a couple of nice fish I christened a new fish from our mutual and good friend Nico at Yamami Rods, and my Black Pearl, an 8'9" 3-weight. I christened it with I think it was 1.5 pounds and just under 2 pound fish. And on that podcast, I talked about leaning into that fish and keeping it out of where it was wanting to go. You have so much more experience with fiberglass. You have so much more experience with big, big fish. And so it's wonderful to hear that. And have you discovered that continually, that the ability of, or your success rate of landing these amazing fish is due to using those glass rods?
I think so completely. The one thing I can say, I don't generally try to cast very far because I'm observing all the time. I'll try to creep up on the fish and get as close as I possibly can. So having the glass isn't a disadvantage. If you need to cast 60, 70, 80 feet with a fly line, then glass is at a little bit of a disadvantage to carbon because you need the longer rod and you need them for the control and everything else. But I try to keep everything within that 40 to 50 feet maximum to minimize the amount of drag on the water. Sometimes I'm not even fishing that far. It can be literally 12 feet, 15 feet. And in that case, the fact that glass loads itself slightly really makes a massive difference. You can present a fly with very little fly line, control it. And yes, when you hook the fish, you can bend into it. You can put more pressure on it. The rod saps a lot of the fish's power. You get them in faster. The hooks hold better. It's just all around it. Like I said, it has genuinely, it's made a massive difference to my ability to land the fish that I've been trying to catch for years. Literally, I would say quadrupled easy the amount that I get to the net. And the last 4 or 5 years, as my glass tastes have changed, which is another interesting thing we'll maybe talk about in a bit, I'm finding that my fish are getting bigger. The ones I'm getting to the net now, I'm definitely landing bigger and bigger fish. Now I know other guys manage this with carbon fiber, but I never could, and it's definitely made a big difference to me.
Yeah. Have you noticed that with I've caught some pretty nice fish at home on bamboo as well, and discovered that I could play fish well with that. Have you found similar?
Oh yes, definitely. I love bamboo. Absolutely love bamboo rods. I've got quite an interesting collection of rods, which I've built up over the years. I've bought a lot. I've sold a lot. It took me a long time to find the ones that I specifically like. But as as you know from the other day, I damaged one of them a couple of years ago doing something that wasn't expected, and it's kind of threw me a bit. Whereas I can't damage the glass, so I'm more inclined to use that more often.
Yeah.
That was an interesting episode, but it kind of broke my heart at the same time.
I feel your pain.
Yes.
That was another great tip for people if you're listening as well, is how close you can get to fish as well. And I think if a good fish is rising, it's focused on that feeding process. And so if you are careful, if you take your time, you can get pretty close to those fish. That enables you to make a shorter cast. That in turn means that drag is going to be less of an issue too. So another great tip there. But I wanted to get onto the building side of things and wanted to discover how you went down that building process, what materials you built on. Was it graphite first, then glass and bamboo, or what the order of that was? And then get a sense of how someone would go about putting together their first rod. So perhaps you can tell me a little bit about that.
A little bit. Yeah, no, about that. I started messing about rods as a teenager, usually repairing things that I'd broken or removing keeper rings because I hate them. It's the way I hold a rod. The keeper ring is always right, ends up being stuck on my finger in it. It drives me up the wall. So I used to remove the keeper rings from rods and then have to tidy them up again afterwards. So I did that for a long time. A long time. It feels like a long time now. It wasn't that long a time, I suppose, really. I did a mature apprenticeship after my son was born, and we were strapped for cash. I'd sold all my fishing gear. I didn't go fishing for a couple of years, and then as that came to the end, it was a case of I can almost have a new start here. I'd always wanted a Sage, and I thought the only way I can get the Sage is to build one. It's the only way I could afford it. So I shopped around, and Sportfish had a cancelled order blank for a Sage LL 389. So I bought that. Then I researched rings, and I bought rings and the threads, and looked up. Bought a nice book. It was actually a book on bamboo by George Mora, which is a great book. I got that. I read that, and I built that rod. Fished it. And it was great. It was probably my first foray into a softer action rod as well. So it was like a twofold revelation, really. It was a case of actually I can build these rods. It's not too bad. And at the same time, I got into this more delicate way of fishing, which suddenly was a case of this is fun. This is a lot more fun than fishing a 7-weight for these rainbows, which I was after at the time from where we were living. And it kind of went from there, really. It then became an excuse to try different rods. You know, at the time, that point in what we talk about 1999, I think, thereabouts. And at that time, Scott, Sage, Winston, even Orvis, most of the big manufacturers would sell blanks. So you could buy a blank and build a rod for a third of the cost of what it would cost to buy the rod. And then effectively, if you didn't like it, I could sell it to somebody via the internet or off a forum for what it had cost me, and then put that money back into the next one. And I think a lot of it stemmed from there. I'm a lifelong fly tyer, and anybody that can tie a half decent fly, if you take your time, you can build a half-decent rod. It's just patience. It's the same dynamic for your hands. If you've got the dexterity to do it, then you'll have no problems whatsoever. If anything, it's easier. It's easier than tying a fly. It's just the patience and getting the epoxy to turn. That's the key. So I reckon I constantly, I have done for years, I try to help lots of people build a rod because I think it's a brilliant thing to do. And it's not hard, and you get that same feeling that you do when you catch a fish for the first time on a fly that you've tied, and then you get it again on a fly that you've invented, and it's the same with a rod. It's another fit. It's just, I don't know. It's a difficult one. It's that, it's a satisfaction, I suppose, and I did this, and it works.
That sounds fantastic. I'd be astounded if I could pull this off, but that you're giving me a little bit more confidence to do so. Great first choice of your first rod, 389 light line, is a classic. I'm taking it definitely. That was obviously the original one. Do you remember that first fish you caught on it? How did that feel when you did that? Was that the ultimate combo, that it was on a fly that you tied yourself, on a rod you built yourself? Do you remember that?
That would definitely have been the case, and no, I don't. Sorry to disappoint, but I don't remember the fish. It would have definitely been a rainbow. It would have been on a fishery around Glasgow somewhere. Beyond that, I think it was, beyond that, I cannot remember. It's a long time ago, and there's a lot of fish been since. And only a handful of them stand out.
You said a couple of minutes ago about major rod manufacturers making blanks available. Does that mean it's easy for somebody to search them down, or are there specialist places that you need to go find these things, or do you need to hunt them down? I'm talking graphite here predominantly before we come on to
before
perhaps
we get onto glass, absolutely.
Glass and bamboo, but is that easy to do?
It was easier to do then than it probably is now, because, like I said, Sage, Scott, Winston, they would all produce blanks, and you could go to the suppliers in the UK and ask, and you could get blanks from a lot of them at the time. But we're talking 20 years ago. I think certainly in the last few years, I know Scott, you can't buy Scott blanks anymore. They won't sell you blanks. Sage blanks you can still get, and Winston blanks you can still get if you know where to look. But I think a lot of it's not quite the same. I think blank-wise, we've got some great suppliers. I mean, we've got Mark Williams at Taniwha Rodworks down south. He's got a great selection of blanks. They're unbranded. They're his own ones, but they're as good as anything that most of the major manufacturers are making. You've got Mick Bell with Bloke. He's always sold people blanks, and he's realistic with his prices. He doesn't charge you over the odds for what they actually are, and you're getting a good quality product, and his service is second. I know he's sold up now, but he's still going to be hanging around a bit, but his service is second to none, same as Mark's. So you can get blanks these days. You can get very, very good carbon blanks these days, but you're probably better going unbranded and speaking to somebody first to find out where to get one from. Certainly Sage you can still get. You probably have to order from the States, though, to get them. I don't think anybody in the UK would stock, apart from Guides and Blanks. Now I'm thinking about it. Guides and Blanks probably have Sage blanks still available. But you'll find that they're not quite the bargains they used to be. But Sage rods, as you know yourself, the price of Sage rods have gone through the roof, as have a lot of the major manufacturers, which probably makes it a really good time for somebody to try and build a first rod. Certainly, there are definitely ways you could build something that would make you feel as good about the rod for a quarter of the price of what you're going to pay for a new high-end rod.
And would you recommend, Sandy, somebody like myself or somebody who's sort of fly rod building curious to start off with a a well-known blank like that, or would you recommend they start with something a little cheaper to hone their skills and learn their trade? Because if something goes wrong, can you put that right as well? If the epoxy doesn't look smart or whatever, can you put those things right?
Some of it depends on the blank, but yes, there's nothing's irreparable. I would add, there's plenty dodgy advice on the internet. So if you did have a problem, you'd be better to speak to an actual rod builder or whoever you got the rod from. I mean, I'm always open for emails. I know guys like Nico and Mark and various other people, they're quite happy to answer questions, and email's easy to answer if people have got patience. I think half the secret, certainly off my experience, the first rod I built from scratch was a Sage LL. So I had a great experience with my first rod because it was a good rod. I think if you bought a cheap blank, you could be disappointed, especially glass. Glass can be very tricky because there is still quite a bit of cheap glass out there, which isn't that great. But there's some reasonable price glass, which is absolutely brilliant. Let's say the stuff that Mark does down at Taniwa, his glass rods are a good price, and they're very, very good. I've used them a few times. His blanks, they're very good. I think, yeah, there's if I'm trying to think about your epoxy question. Your epoxy, if you messed up a wrap, if you were using a standard carbon blank or a decent glass blank that wasn't painted, then it's very easy to repair. Very easy to take the wrap off. You just let it go hard, slice along the edge of the ring, and it just peels off. There's no problem to that whatsoever. The only issue you run into with that, if the blank is painted, a lot of the time the epoxy will lift the paint off. So you end up with an unsightly mark. If you're using a dark thread, you could probably cover it all up again and it wouldn't be an issue. It doesn't work for me because obviously my thing a lot of the time is my wraps are almost invisible or highly translucent with colours. So painted blanks and me don't get on very well if I'm having to repair them or whatever. But certainly unpainted blanks would be the way to go for a start. Get something either natural carbon or an unpainted glass, and then you have no fear. And you'd be better to spend the money on a decent one, I would say, first up, because it's not difficult. And you might make one or two wee errors, but you can do it. If you can do them again. I mean, I rebuilt that Sage twice over my building career, if you like, because by the time I built it the third time, it was the rod I always imagined it was, if you know what I mean, because my ability to do epoxy had improved and the things I'd learned, and there wasn't that much advice out there. I did an awful lot of it by trial and error. There's a huge amount more people doing it. There's more advice. There's lots of other things that are out there now with YouTube and the like, although you could be very careful with some of the YouTube advice. I mean, I've seen quite a few on there. I've had people come back to me and go, I did this on the guy on YouTube heated up the epoxy, and you just go, no, you don't go anywhere near a blank with heat, whatever you do, because you can destroy a blank. You know, you're much better off with a very sharp knife. But that's just my opinion, but that's based on the things I've learned over the years.
Great. It's we're going to come on to glass because I'm getting the sense already that's a real passion of yours. There's a couple of questions I've got in my mind, though, is what are the common mistakes that you see newcomers to rod building making, and other ways to overcome those? And also the spine as well on a rod. And I wondered for the listeners if you could explain what the spine of a rod is and how you set up a rod versus where the spine's positioned. Perhaps you'd tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Okay, the spine of a rod. Well, a carbon fibre rod or a glass rod doesn't really have a spine. This is personal opinion. A bamboo rod definitely has a spine, in that one of the strips will generally be stiffer than the rest, therefore it acts like a spine. With a glass blank or even a carbon blank, it has what I always refer to as a preferred plane of bending. Manufacturers will always wrap a blank for straight, because if you go into a shop to buy a rod, you'll put the rings together and you put it up to the light and you look down the line of rings, and if the rod's straight, you think, oh, that's a good rod. If it bends off to the side, you're going to go, oh, this one's bent. This is at a normal customer level, I suppose. Whereas when I'm building, because it's all custom and everything's done for individual customers, and for all my own rods, I always wrap on what I regard as the preferred plane of bending. Easy to find. You put the section of rod completely horizontal. It can be on the carpet, on the table, or whatever. You put your finger directly on the top of it and you push down, and the blank will deflect. That section will deflect in a direction. Try it 3 or 4 times. It'll probably go the same direction 3 or 4 times. You then have your preferred plane of bending. Mark the inside of the curve and put the rings on that line. You can usually do that with the top 2 sections, sometimes with a third section, but not normally. So a butt section, I'll just wrap for straight. I'll just leave that. I won't even bother trying to find it, because there's no way you're going to deflect it. It's far too rigid. But it's definitely the top 2 sections, I always put the rings on the inside of that preferred plane of bending. And what that does for me is it makes the rod track straighter. We've tried this. I've done experiments before where I've rewrapped the rod in 4 different positions to see if it's tangible. And it is tangible. You can definitely tell the difference. It definitely improves the accuracy of the rod. I think it doesn't deflect to the side during the stroke when you're casting quite as much. I mean, we're talking tiny amounts, really, because a blank's a blank. It'll do what it does in a direction, but it's like you're taking something that's good at what it does, and you're just fine-tuning it ever so slightly so it becomes exactly what it's meant to be. That's one of the joys of building a rod yourself as well, is you get to do that. Because the likes of, for example, for sage, if you get a sage blank, it'll have the marks on it for straight. You'll get it, they mark up the blanks with dots, and they're all marked for the rod being straight. I've quite often done the deflection test and the PPBs on a different line, and you end up with so you can wrap it properly. When you afterwards, if you line it up and you look down the guides, it probably won't look straight, but it will cast better. When it's in, the dynamic forces will take over when it's casting, and it definitely improves the rod.
That's interesting. You mentioned about the no sideways movement during the cast, and I think of rod manufacturers using that in their process and subsequently their advertising. And I thought, oh, right, okay. And actually casting those rods, I noticed that difference with accuracy. Now, they are minuscule, but to me at least noticeable. So it's kind of cool to hear that. So thank you for pointing that out to us. So what common mistakes do you see first-time rod builders making, and how can they overcome them?
The only mistake that most people tend to do, that I've had when I've spoken to people, is when you put your first coat of epoxy on, they'll put it on too thick. And then once that's set, that sets a precedent for the rest of the build. You're far, far better, rather than thinking, I'll do it in 2 coats, you're much better off doing it in 4 and accepting it's going to take you a lot longer. Patience is always the key. Oh, excuse me. After that first coat, you always get, with nylon or silk or whatever, you will get little hairs sticking out of the wraps. And if you go near that with wet and dry or sandpaper, you'll make it worse. You're better with a scalpel blade, and you just slice them off. Don't scratch it or file it, or just slice them off. And don't worry about little bumps. Some people they want to file it completely flat. Epoxy self-leveling. When you put the second coat on, it'll self-level over all the little bumps. When your second coat's dry, you might still have one or two. Again, scalpel blade out, slice them all off, and go for a third coat. And honestly, your finish, 3 coats of epoxy is perfect, usually, as long as you don't put on too much in the first place. And that's the most common mistake, is people look at it and they think, oh, the thread soaked it all up, I better put some more on. Don't. You want the thread to soak up the first coat. Ideally, you want to thin the first coat down so it soaks it up completely and kicks all the air out, so there's no air bubbles. And it will look scruffy after the first coat. It always does. But like I say, if you can, any big hairs you slice off, and then you put the second coat on, and then the second coat determines how the third coat's going to come out. It's just steps, really. But yes, thin it down, use thin coats. Don't try to do it too fast, and never, ever go near it with sandpaper or a file. That'd definitely be the most common mistake I've heard people make.
Great advice there. That's really inspiring to hear that. It's getting me excited, and I'm thinking things through in my mind at the moment. What you mentioned, sharp scalpel blade. What sort of extra tools do you need to get yourself going?
Depends how you're going to do it. You don't really need many tools at all. A scalpel blade. I use kids' plastic paintbrushes. You know, the really, really cheap ones that you get that have got nylon bristles, thick nylon bristles. That's what I use for building rods, primarily because, you'll see people using nice paintbrushes and all the rest of it. The downside to a nice paintbrush with an ordinary paintbrush, if you like a sable type thing, okay, yes, it's nice, it looks good, it gives you a nice finish, but they're little tiny hairs. They're really, really thin. If they fall out, they'll go into the epoxy and you can't see them. You won't see them until it's finished and it's gone hard. I prefer, like I say, cheap kids' paintbrushes, nice thick nylon bristles. If one of them comes out, they never come out because they're welded into the plastic brush. But if one of them does come out, you can see it a mile away and you can fish it out of the epoxy before you even get to the end. That can save a lot of heartache. What else would you need? Not a great deal. A rod turner is ideal if you can. I think a lot of people have fly turners which have got a little stand which they can then set up. I've seen people make rod turners out of Lego, using Lego motors. No, hey, all it's got to do is hold the end of the rod, you know. My first rod I built it on a shoebox. I cut 2 V's into the shoebox and just turned it every few minutes for the first 2 or 3 hours, and then as it starts to cure, you can wait, but you end up having to go backwards and forwards over the space of about 8 hours before it really gets to the point where you can leave it to set. You're much better with a rod turner if you can. Like I say, even heat rod, anything that you can set up like that, even with the shoebox. You know, you can have the shoebox, nick some of the kids' Lego, set up a little. All it has to do is sit and turn relatively slowly while the epoxy dries, and it just stops it from sagging. Again, one of the joys of using thin coats is it's less likely to sag. You know, it'll take longer to cure, but it is less likely to sag. So most of it's patience. It is entirely patience. The finish you get at the end will depend on how much time you've taken to do things and let things dry. So, yeah, I think beyond that, there's no real specialised equipment that you actually need. There's lots of things you can have, which are nice to have, and different people do it different ways. I mean, I don't use a rod wrapper. I find a rod wrapper, I hate them. They're horrible things. But most people use them all the time. I hold the spool of silk in one hand, and I spin the rod with the other hand. And that allows me to control the tension of the silk. And then I can use my finger as I go along to make sure everything's butted up against each other, so I get a nice flush wrap. The scalpel blade, yes, I go through lots and lots of scalpel blades. I'll probably one per rod, because when they're really fresh and really sharp, they're fantastic. Because if you hold the tension on the silk, once you've put the loop through and pulled it back in to finish the wrap, you hold the tension, you just have to touch it with the scalpel blade, and it'll just flare slightly, and then as soon as it flares slightly, it sits back in underneath the silk, and it disappears. So you have no tag ends sticking out, which reduces the amount of things you then have to slice off the next time round. I think really that would probably be about it. A rod turner's, if you think you're going to make more than one, then yes, I would even invest in one. A simple one. They're not hugely expensive. I say Stonefly's fly tire, fly drying thingy used to come with 2 stands that you could do. You could convert it with a chuck to do rods. I used a bank. I used to have 3 of those set up on the table for many years before I bought the bank that I've got now, which can turn 4 bits at a time, which is great. That cuts the time down a lot.
Brilliant.
But you don't need to spend that money. Like I say, the kids Lego in a shoebox does the same job, really.
Fantastic. That's some great and inspiring advice there as well. So as I say, my mind is probably turning faster than your rod turner at the moment. I'm thinking things. I'm thinking things through at the moment. It
doesn't turn very fast, so yeah.
That's what. So let's get on to it now. As I said, I've detected from the very beginning a passion for glass rods. How did that start? And where are you with that now? When did you first started thinking? Because I think about, again, and I've talked about it, apologies to listeners, about glass rods I tried many years ago, and they put me off for many years. Subsequently coming back to it, I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is really cool and really usable material again. Where did your journey start with glass, and when did the passion for it really ignite?
Glass has been a real slow burn with me. I used my first fly rod I got when I was 11. That was a glass rod. I didn't know any different. Let's have a think about this, because when probably about 2011, Scott, I came across a Scott F. Yeah, I think it was an F. It wasn't an F2. And I bought it thinking, this is really nice. I was into bamboo by that point. I must admit, I did bamboo first. And that was a romantic thing. That was I'll try this, and I really enjoyed it. I thought that was great. So, and I thought, well, glass is a bit more durable. Let's have a go with the glass rod. And I couldn't get on with it. I struggled with it. And then I tried another one, and I couldn't get on with that. And it probably much the same as yourself. It was like I'd maybe fished carbon for too long. And then 2012, Mike Barrio's a friend of mine, and he'd been speaking to Carl McNeil, and Carl had said, I've got this new product, the Epics. I'm doing fiberglass rods, and Mike had gone, fiberglass, really? Okay, well, they're both fellow Kiwis. Kiwis come into this quite a lot, because Mark Williams is obviously a Kiwi as well down at Taniwa, so it seems to have come out of niche again, romantic. Oh, this is from New Zealand. This is cool. I've fished New Zealand. I love the country. There was an element to that, and it was case, well, let's try it. So Carl sent some blanks across to Mike, and Mike says, "Here you go. Let's play with these and see what we can do." So we built one, and it was, what's this? This is, yeah, okay. This is interesting. This is different, and we fished it, cast with it, played with lines with it, fished with it, cast with it, played with lines with it, put it away. Thought, maybe not. And then one day I just thought, I'm going to take this down the river. And I took it down the river, and I was fishing spiders, and I picked up a fish about 3 3/4 pound on it, and it was like, bing! This is fun. This is amazing. This is just And then it became an obsession. It really did. I have to try that one, and I have to try this one, and I have to try that one. And there's such a wide variety of different types. But I mean, I was hook, line, and sinker epic, very much so for many years. Especially the 476, the 4-weight, 7'6" for a 4-weight. That was just it was like the peach in the range, the original range that was CTS made in New Zealand, and it was just that rod and me went. I had brownies on that up to 5 3/4 pound. That's on 4-weight on a dry fly, without issues, without problems, you know. And then the last few years, it became what else is out there, and I met via the internet. I met Chris Barkley, got speaking to him, and I got one of his rods, and that was just, what's this? It was like going through the whole same procedure again. It was, what's this material? And his rods are all E-glass, and they all come from Mike McFarland. And it was, wow, this is different again, and it's like a progression. So I've been building using Mike McFarland's blanks for the last couple of years because they're just phenomenal, and it's a different material. They're a lovely sunshine yellow color, which makes you smile every time you look at them. And again, he's got different rods, horses for courses, different rods for different reasons, different purposes. But within his range, he's got a 7'6", 3-weight, 3-piece, what he calls a classic blank. And for me, it's just been, I've fished it all year. It was bought as an experiment to see what it would be like, and it's just a rod I just can't leave alone. It's probably the best dry fly rod, I think, in any material I've ever used for the way I fish. You know, it'll turn big flies over. It'll do everything except indicators. It doesn't like throwing indicators, which is fine because that's nymphing, and we don't want to go there. We don't need to be on the dark side all the time, do you? So, but it's been a journey of ups and not ups and downs, but sort of waxing and waning. You know, it's my taste in glass has progressed. I remember trying one of Tomo's from Japan, the Ijuin blanks. I tried one of them very early on in my glass experience, and I wasn't hugely sold on that. But last winter, I built 2 or 3 of them, and they were brilliant. I took them outside, and I was casting with them, and I'm just thinking, why didn't I really like it? I remember as not liking these, and this is just delightful. It's just delightful. And I think if you come off carbon and go to glass, and you have something like the Epic Fast Glass or one of McFarland's Spruce Creeks, then it's an easy transition because it's a similar casting stroke, and then you get the benefits of the glass. Once you've fished one of them for 2 or 3 seasons, you tune yourself into how glass casts, and then somebody will hand you a more classic one, like one of his classics, or an Ijuin or a Stefan or something like that, which have been around for a long, long time in a very small niche. And you suddenly pick that up and your casting's changed in such a way that you adapt to this, and you kind of get even more benefit of the glass. You know, it's hard to explain, but it's like an evolutionary process. I think if you try some of the real top end stuff, like I say, like a Stefan, for example, if you try a Stefan as your first glass rod, you're going to go, don't know what to make of this. Whereas an Epic or a Spruce Creek, you'll pick up and cast and go, wow, this is amazing. But 5 years down the road, somebody will hand you a Stefan and you'll go, wow, this is amazing. Yeah. It's curious. It's a curious one. And it's one of the really good reasons why, if you are looking at building, if you speak to the likes of Mark or Nico or myself or Chris or any of these guys and tell them what you're used to, most people will be able to make it, well, try this one because this is the one you're probably going to like. And that definitely helps.
Yeah, sorry, carry on, please.
That's all right. I was going to say it's not the easiest thing to do, trying glass. And most of the really good stuff it's all niche. It all comes from custom independent builders. So unless you're at a fly show or a fishing show, which has been really nigh on impossible in the last 2 years, then the only way you get to try them is from friends or like-minded people.
And it seems
that can be the tough bit.
And it seems to me that you were at sort of the forefront of that glass is not dead revolution with Carl, as you say, you know, with the Epic. And I think we were talking back then in the Eat, Sleep, Fish days, and I remember saying to you how much I loved the red rod that he did and how stunning that was, and that kit that you could buy the whole thing in a box, and the box turned into a, you know, so that you could build your rod from there. You had the fiberglass manifesto, you had stuff that you were doing and other people, and it's continued. You could be forgiven for thinking, well, this will just be a fad, but it's a fad all those years, 9-10 years later, that's still going on. And I've noticed as well, fishing them, that casting, it helps with casting, as does bamboo. You get to understand a slowdown, you get the sense of feel, everything else added to. And I know you were joking about the nymphing as well, and it got me thinking about glass rods playing fish. And I was going to throw out to listeners that if you're nymph anglers and if you're fishing with a dedicated nymph rod with that soft tip, think how many fish you don't lose fishing a nymphing rod compared to your traditional graphite dry or duo rod. And I think it's kind of similar with glass, that ability. I know when I'm using a nymph rod or a glass rod, I've got a pretty good chance that I'm going to land that fish and I can lean into it that little bit harder. And like you said, with the coloration of the yellow rod that you have, the red I've just alluded to, they come in some really cool colours as well, don't they?
They do, definitely. That was one of the attractions originally, is the fact it was different. And I suppose, especially from a builder's perspective, I mean, okay, it's a hobby. It's a hobby. It keeps me out of trouble during the winter, and it's great that it's now become a self-sustaining hobby. But the joys of that is you get to try all sorts of different things, and the colors are just magic for building on, because you can do every one can look different. Even the yellow McFarlane blanks. I mean, you can change the color. It sounds like it's not a strong color. It's all a very neutral color, which has so many options for different types of wraps to get different effects, that you can make rods look completely different using the same color base blank, and it's good fun. It's good. It definitely adds to the enjoyment of building.
Yeah. Where do you see, we're going to start winding up because we're coming up over an hour now as well. How do you see rod blank manufacture going in the near to medium term? Let's talk about glass first up. Where do you see that going?
I think the good glass that's out there now has been around for a while, and I don't think it's going to change. I don't think there's any need for it to progress. to be perfectly honest. I think the major manufacturers with carbon rods have gone too far. Everything's gotten lighter and lighter and lighter, and swing weight comes down and down and down, and then all of a sudden, again, it's personal opinion, but you lose the feel. You that sensitivity. That yes, the rod's incredibly light in your hand, and it shoots fantastic because it's stiff. Or not even stiff sometimes. It's light and crisp, and you can shoot, but you don't cast. I fish. I have one carbon rod that I fish, and it's a 2005 Stefan 8'6" 3/4 weight. Now, weight-wise, it feels like a modern rod. You pick it up now, it feels like a modern rod. It casts like a fast glass. It's just beautiful, but it has just a little bit of weight. It's like you say to somebody, it's got a little bit of weight in the tip, and they go, ah, but no, it's still light in your hand. You stick 4-ounce fly reel on the end of it, and the rod's balanced perfectly in your grip. But when you cast, it's got just that little bit of weight, which you then feel the line load, and you've got complete control. And I think that, although some of the manufacturers have are now getting onto this medium action rods because of the glass market and people wanting to go a bit slower, you're getting a medium action rod, but they're still making them out of these super light materials. And it's fine. It doesn't. If you're fishing all day, you don't notice you've had the rod and all the rest of it. But I just think it's lost something. I think they've gone too far. They've gone just for the sake of progress. I think the glass guys, there's an increasing market. I get the last 2 or 3 years definitely has been an increase in more people asking for it, more people asking where they can get it. There are more people producing it at a niche level. So it's like a cottage industry almost. So, but there's definitely more and more people fishing glass, and I think that's why. I think it's because you can feel it load, and a 7'9" 4-weight glass, even with your black pearl, which is 8'9", you know yourself, they're not heavy. They're light. They're still light. They're certainly light enough that you would never notice the difference over the course of a day's fishing. What you won't notice is the fact that you're now casting rather than shooting. Until you start trying to bend it around rocks and under trees, and it's going where you want it to, and you think, "Oh, this is cool." So I think largely the manufacturer. I don't think it'll progress that much further. I mean, the materials have been around since the Second World War. The glass material, both glass materials, S and E glass, because one's structural and one's electric, and that's what it was for. Each material is good for different things. Anything under 8 foot, E-glass for me is better. Anything over 8 foot, S-glass is better because it's about just the way the materials work. And Mike McFarland always says it's got nothing to do with the materials. It's all down to the taper of the rod, and he proves it time and time again. So I have no reason to question anything he says.
Good points. And let's go on to next year then. I was thinking actually while you were saying about glass not needing to move on, and I think you hit the nail on the head, didn't you, with cottage industry, that they're not huge multinational, or that they're not big companies, so they don't need to continually, I don't want to use the word reinvent the wheel, but have to come up with a new product to sell into the marketplace every 4 to 5 years. With glass, there's not the need for that, is there, I guess?
No, I don't think so. I think it's like bamboo. I mean, you look at the bamboo market. If you want a bamboo rod, you go to somebody who's going to make one. Invariably, it's probably on a classic taper or something based on a classic taper that could be up to 100 years old, the original design. You're getting a modern product with modern glues and modern varnishes and finished in a modern way, but the essential design's 100 years old. Why change it? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think the glass guys, people like Tomo in Japan and Mike who designed the blanks. I think some of the blank design is so good, there's no need. You know, It's just a matter of trying them, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that, and I always try and say to people, if you can get the chance to cast one, cast one. Sandy, you've given so much information. It's very, very clear that you know your stuff, both from a fishing perspective, from a rod building, from a casting, and understanding how the product works too. How, if people want to get hold of you for you to build them a rod, or they want some information, how do people connect with you? What are your social media handles, and how do they find you?
Well, probably the best way to get hold of me is Sandy's Custom Fly Rods on Instagram. Sandy Nelson on Facebook, and I have my own web page which is attached to the fishingthefly.co.uk website. There's plenty of pictures on there. Instagram's the best way. I'm quite happy. I'll talk rods with anybody for hours and hours and hours, which is why it was always going to be difficult to bring this down to make this fit into a decent slot. You get me on any subject, I can ramble on for ages, but I'm quite happy to answer any questions people have all the time. I love people to build their own rods. You know, it's a great thing to do. It's not difficult. It's nowhere near as hard as what people think. So, yeah, I'd say Instagram, Sandy's Custom Fly Rods is probably the best bet. And then just take it from there.
Brilliant. Sandy, it's been wonderful to catch up. I feel like I've known you years and years and years, and this is the first time.
Well, we have, kind of. It's just the first time we've talked, that's all.
Yeah, and I could have carried on for hours. There's so many things I wanted to ask you, but I try and keep these podcasts to an hour or so. But there's so much from this, and it's so inspirational speaking to you about this, and I can sense and feel your passion while we're talking, which has certainly rubbed off on me. I know, well, I'm going to go and look at some stuff after that we've spoken. It may take a bit of time, but I'm thinking about what I might build as well, or make as my first build as well. So I'm sure I'm going to I'm going to bother you at some stage as well. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's been absolutely brilliant. I've really, really loved it.
I've enjoyed that too. And I would say, just as a finishing one, you're saying there, think about what it's for. That's probably the key. I think if you consider what you're going to build, what you want to use the rod for, and then build something that's appropriate, then you're going to use it and you're going to enjoy it.
There's some good words to end on. Sandy, thank you so much for being on the Fly Culture podcast today.
No problem, Pete. Thanks very much.
Hey everyone, well that's another Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope, like I say, it's been inspirational for you. This one, as ever, we don't over-edit these. This is just a conversation between two fly anglers talking about stuff. Nothing's edited here. It's exactly as it's happened. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you are enjoying these, then I hope you might consider subscribing to the Fly Culture podcast on iTunes or wherever else. Greatly appreciated. But thanks again for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. There'll be some more real soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.